Hey there, this is Kamal, and in this video we're going to carry on with what we were learning in the previous video about Angular. So let's get started. Alright, so in the previous video we've seen how we can actually create posts inside of our blog page. So if I go to my browser, you'll see that we've seen how we can actually retrieve the data from our mock database and showcase that data in the front end part in the home page as well as the blog page. Right, and the data that we're getting is actually present inside our mock-post file. And also we've created two components to showcase the data. The first one was the post component, which is the parent component, and also we've seen the individual post component, right? So those were the two components that we had created. We also seen how we can send the data from the parent component, that is the post, to the child component, that is the individual post, right? So we've seen how we can use a for loop for that, and we have sent the data through this particular syntax, right? We've also seen how we can send a variable data as well using the column class. So we were done with basically all of that. Now what we'll be doing is that we'll be actually going on with the next operation, that is delete. But before doing that, let's actually make a change. So till now we were actually working on a dummy database present inside our project structure, right? So we had a mock-post which was acting as our own server, or more like our database or a backend. But this is not the correct way of dealing with the backend, because generally when you create an Angular application, you interact with a backend API or a backend database which is completely present online. But the thing is that this is not actually replicating that functionality. So what we'll be doing is that we'll remove this mock-post as our backend, and we'll use something else called as a Json Server as our backend. Okay, so in this video we'll be installing that. We'll be actually implementing that Json server and creating our own backend with the same data. Then we'll be retrieving the data back from that backend and showcasing that data to the front end. And also we'll see how we can delete our posts from the database as well. So let's actually do all of this today, right? So first things first, we have to go to the browser and search for Json Server. So you can open a new tab and type in Json Server. So you can open the npm package for that. So I'll open that, or you can go to the Git repository as well. I'll go to the npm page for this. So in that, you can see that this is a full fake REST API with zero coding, and it can be set up in less than 30 seconds, right? So let's scroll down, and if you see here in the getting started section, you have an npm command that you have to execute. So let's copy this and let's go to our application, and that let's open the terminal. Let's create a new instance, and that let's type in that particular command, npm install -g space Json server. And if I click on install, that should actually install the Json server into our Angular application. So let's wait for it to finish. Okay, so now that we're done with that, we can go back to the browser, and you can see that they are saying that we have to create a file called as db.json. So let me create a file inside my root directory. So I'll minimize everything. So in the same directory where you have the package.json, let me create a new file, and I'll name it as db.json. So you have to make sure you place it inside your root directory. Okay. Now inside of this, they're seeing that we have to have this particular kind of content. So let me copy that. Let's paste it inside the db.json. Let's actually close the terminal for now. Okay, so let me format this a bit. So I'll right click here, format. Okay, fine. So this is what it should look like. Now what I'll do is that this is actually following the Json syntax. Okay, so you can think of JSON as similar to a JavaScript object. The only difference between, the major difference that we generally see is that in JSON objects, you have the keys wrapped inside of quotations. Okay, so in JavaScript objects, you don't have keys in your quotations. You can either have it like that, or you can actually leave it. But for JSON objects, you have to actually have them inside of quotations, and also the strings that you have on the right hand side. Those are the values should also be wrapped inside double quotations. It cannot be single. It should only be double. So now what I'll do is that I'll actually remove this from here. We only need to work with posts. So I'll remove this comma as well. Then what I'll do is that we already actually have this data, right? So if I go to my mock post, we have this data. So I can actually copy this multiple objects that I have here, and I can go back to my db.json. I can replace this with that particular content. Now let me, select everything here, and let's actually refactor this to actually suit it for the JSON object. So let me quickly do that. Okay, so once I have wrapped everything inside the double quotations, all the errors have disappeared, right? So now we have a JSON object with some data. So let me actually copy this 2 more times, and let's actually have, let's say, 5 posts. Okay, so now we are actually done with creating our, database file. So this file will act as our, database. But the thing is that we are not going to interact with this particular file similar to how we had interacted with this, mock-post. Instead, we'll be actually, interacting with this through the URL or the API. So let me actually give you an example of that. So if I go back to the browser once again, and if you scroll down here, you can see that there's a command here for start Json server. So you can actually copy this particular command, and if I go to my terminal once again, let's open the terminal here, and now I can actually type that command here, Json Server --watch space db.json. Once you click on enter, it's going to actually execute that, and it's going to give you a URL, and it's going to be localhost 3000. So we have our Angular application on localhost 4200. Similarly, we have this JSON application on the localhost 3000. So I can open a new tab and I can type in localhost 3000. And you'll see that we have interface wherein you have the page representing the JSON server. So in here you can go to resources, and if you click on post, you'll see that we actually have our data, right? So this is the JSON data that is present inside our application. So this is the exact data that you see in this db.json. So if you observe the URL, you'll see that we have the URL as localhost 3000/post. That means that when you use this particular URL, you're retrieving this particular data. If I now go to the URL once again, and if I type in, let's say /1, that's going to give me my first post. If I give it as, let's say 2, that's going to give me my second post. So in this way, you can use this particular URL to retrieve the data from the database. So this JSON server is actually acting as our API, and it is actually sending us our database data back. Okay, so whenever I use this particular URL, I can retrieve that data from the database. So let me actually show how we can do that. So let's go back to this. So now what I'll do is that we actually have two servers running, right? The Angular and the JSON server. So I'll close off my terminal now. So we don't need that anymore. Now what I'll do is that I'll close off the JSON file as well. Now let's actually create a service layer. Okay, so you can think of service layer as a layer wherein you write the logic of interacting with the API. So you can actually write the logic inside the TS file as well, but it's always better to have a separate layer, and more like in this case a layer as like a folder or a file that can be used to actually execute a particular logic. So let me quickly do that, and then we'll actually understand what's happening here. So I'll go back and I'll create a new terminal instance. In that, let's type in as ng generate service. In that, you can type in the service name. So what I'll do is that I'll place my services inside my services folder. So I'll create a folder called as services. In that, the service name is going to be post. So if I execute this, that should actually create a services folder, and also inside of that, it's going to create the post.service file, right? The post.service.ts file. So let's close off the terminal. Now, if you observe here, you have the normal import statement, and you also have the class. The only thing that is new here is that you have something called as @injectable. So this @injectable is saying that this post.service is a service layer file, and this can be injected wherever we want inside our project structure. So in order to actually understand this injectable, you need to understand a concept called as dependency injection. I'll give you a basic idea of what dependency injection is. I'll not be going too deep into that. So you can think of dependency injection as, calling a particular piece of logic or a particular function wherever you want, whenever you want. Okay. So let's say I want to retrieve some data from the API. So I'll create a function inside my service layer that is in this file. And whenever I want to retrieve the data, instead of writing the logic once again, I can just, call this particular service layer, that is this particular file, and execute that function inside of that file. And that's going to return me back my data, right? So in this way, you can execute any kind of logic through the service layer wherever you want inside of your project structure. That means you're injecting specific blocks or executing specific blocks only at that moment when you require it. So that can be thought of as one type of explanation of dependency injection, though that is not the correct way, but still that will be easy for you to understand. So let me now actually create something, and then we'll see how we can actually execute this. So we'll actually have to retrieve the data from the database, right? So let me create a function wherein we can actually retrieve the data. So let's say it's going to be get post. Now inside this function we have to execute something, and it has to return something, right? So before doing that, let's actually take the URL that we have here, localhost 3000/post, and let's actually create a private variable inside our class. So I have created a private variable called as API URL, and I've given it the value of the URL. Now I can actually use this URL. So what I'll do is that I have to now interact with this particular URL. So inside of Angular, if you want to interact with any APIs or backend servers or whatever you want, then you have to use a module which is present inside of Angular called as the HTTP module. So that is not present by default. You have to import that. So for that, let's go to the module file, and in that we have to write in the import statement at the top. So I'll go here. Let's actually separate the modules. Okay, so we have all the modules at the top. Now let's type in the import statement. So we have imported the HTTP client module from Angular common HTTP folder. Okay, so this is the location of where this particular module is present inside of Angular. Now we have to include that inside the imports array as well. So it's going to be HTTP client module. So now we are actually done with importing that. Now we can use this inside our structure. So what I can do is that I can actually import that. So I'm not going to import the whole module. I'll just import a particular part of it. So I have imported the HTTP client from this particular module. So now if you want to use this HTTP client, you can directly use this variable, or you can actually create an object for this. Okay, so I'll be creating an instance, or you can think of it as an object for this. So I'll be doing that inside my constructor, okay, because the constructor will be executed as soon as the class is initiated, right? So I'll create a new, object. So it's going to be private, and let's say it's going to be something like HTTP, and it's going to have a type, and that's going to be the HTTP client. So I'm trying to use the TypeScript syntax. So I have to give the variable name, then the data type is going to be HTTP client. So this will create an object for this, okay? Or you can think of it as simply a variable as well. Now using this particular HTTP variable, I can interact with this API, that is the URL. So for that, you have to type in HTTP dot, so it has to be this dot HTTP, because this HTTP is a variable present inside the class. So you have to use the this operator. So this dot HTTP dot, then you have to type in what type of request that you want to do, whether it's going to be a get, post, put, or delete. Okay, so we mainly use 4 types of things inside our API interaction. The first one is get. Okay, so we use get to retrieve the data. Apart from get, we also have something called as post. So we use post to send the data to the server or store the data. Then we use put to update the data. Then we use delete, or in some cases destroy, to destroy or delete that particular record. Okay, so these are the 4 functions or methodologies that we follow inside of our API interaction. So in this case, I'm trying to retrieve the data, so I use get. When I want to store the data, I use post. When I want to update the data, I use put, and when I want to delete that, I use the delete function. Okay, so in this case, I'm trying to retrieve that. So let's go with get. Then inside this, you have to type in the URL. So in this case, the URL is API URL. So it's going to be this dot API URL. Now this should actually retrieve me the data, right? So I have to actually return this, right? So I'll type in as a return, and whenever I call this particular function, it's going to execute this, and it's going to return me back that data. So now if I go to my application, you can see that if I want to actually use this service or this logic, what I have to do is that I can go to my components where I want to execute this. So in this case, I have to go to the post, because we have to retrieve the data from the database inside the post application, right? So let's go to the TS file of that. In the TS file, we are trying to retrieve the data from the mock-post. So let me comment this out. We don't require that anymore. Instead, let's actually call the service layer. So for that, what I'll do is that I'll initiate a new instance of this. So similar to how you have instantiated the HTTP client here, we'll be calling the service layer here as well by instantiating that inside my constructor. So it's going to be private. Then let's say I'll give it a name called as post service. Then that it's going to have data type of, let's say, post service. So yeah, it's going to be something like that. Now what I have to do is that I have to retrieve the data and have to add that data to the post. So I'll go to my ng on init. So we'll worry about why we're using constructor and ng on init later on, but for now you can execute your command instead of this, and that should work. So I can use this post service variable, and inside the post service I want to execute a function called as get post. And as soon as I type in the dot, you'll see that it is autofilling that get post. So that get post is a function that we had created, right? So I have to call that function, and this should actually retrieve me data. So the thing with this is that even though if you execute this right now, you're gonna have errors, because this is a request that is being sent, and this thing is retrieving the data from the URL. But the thing is that this takes a bit of time, right? So it takes some time to retrieve the data from the API. But JavaScript is asynchronous in nature, meaning that it's going to just execute that, and it's not going to wait for the data to be retrieved back. Instead, it's going to keep on continuing and execute the remaining statements. So because of that, there will be no data, and you will have errors in the upcoming execution. So because of this asynchronous nature, we cannot directly, execute a query and wait for it to, get the data back. Instead, what we have to tell to JavaScript is that it has to actually wait for this, data to be retrieved. Otherwise, it's going to have errors. So the way that you tell JavaScript that this particular function has to be, observed or, taken care of is by using something called as an observable. Okay, let me actually type that out. So we have to import the observable from the RxJS library. So this is the library wherein we have the observable. So we can use this observable to actually tell to JavaScript that this particular function has to be observed. Okay, that means this particular function will retrieve us some data, but it might not be right now. It might give us some data in the future. Okay, so it has to wait or it has to observe this so that the data is being returned or not. Okay, so the way that you actually do this is by using the TypeScript syntax. So I'm going to use the colon for the function and it's going to be observable. So I can type that out and that should work. The thing is that since we're using TypeScript, we also have to mention what type of data it is being returned. So this is going to return some data, right? So it has to be of some data type, like it has to be, of some format. So in this case, the data is going to be, in the format of a post, right? It's going to be of a post format. So I can type it as post and that particular, statement will be imported here, import post from /post. So now this observable is saying that this particular function will return some data and it's going to be of data type post. So I can, do the exact same thing for the get as well. And that should actually resolve all the errors. So you're saying that this particular function is going to return as data in the format of a post. So you have to remember to add this out here. If you want, you can remove this and you can type in any. So that means that this can return any kind of data type. If you want to specifically say that it's going to return only data of the format of a post, then you can type it as post. Or if you want to say that it can return data of any data type, then you can use the any keyword. So in this case, I'll leave it as post. So now if I execute this function, this will be executed. But the only remaining thing that we have to do is that we have to actually, tell to JavaScript that since this is being observed, you have to actually, make it so that this will be observed continuously. So that means you have to subscribe to this. So there is a function that you have to execute inside, wherever you're calling the statement. So it's going to be something like subscribe. So it's more like subscribing to a YouTube channel, saying that whenever that particular YouTuber posts something like a new video, you'll have a notification, right? Similarly, whenever this particular function returns something, you're going to have an indication to JavaScript saying that it has returned something. So you're essentially subscribing to this particular function, and this observable and subscribe go hand in hand. So if you use observable, you should generally use subscribe as well. Okay. So I have used observable for the function and have used subscribe inside of the, wherever I'm calling the service layer. Now, once the data has been retrieved, once that data is retrieved, we have to actually save that data inside this particular variable, right? So I'll remove this from here and I'll give it as any, saying that this particular variable can be of any data type. So now once we have the data retrieved back from the post, we have to add that data to this variable. And the way that we do that is by using an arrow function. So that arrow function is generally written inside the subscribe function. So it's going to be something like this. You're saying that whenever it returns something, so it's going to send us back some retrieved data. So whatever data is being retrieved will be stored inside this variable. Now I want to add this data to this post variable. So it's going to be something like this. This dot post is equal to retrieved data. This is going to execute and this retrieved data will be added to this post variable. So I actually forgot one thing, and that is that this data that this post is going to return is not just a single post. Instead, it's an array of posts, right? So you have to type in an array here as well, because it's not a single post, it's an array of multiple posts. If I now save this and go to my browser, let's go back to our page. Let's zoom out. Okay, you'll see that we actually have the data, right? We actually have the 5 posts that we had created, right? So these are the 5 posts that we have inside our database, right? So these are the 5 posts that are being showcased here. If you go to the blog page as well, you'll have the same data because that is the same component, right? So in this way, you can retrieve the data back from our database by using a service layer. So the logic is pretty simple. You're creating a function and you're returning that data. By using the HTTP module, you're executing a particular query, right? So since that data can be returned sometime in the future, you're creating an observable saying that this particular function will return data, and that data can be written in the future as well. So JavaScript has to observe this. And since you have created an observable function, you have to subscribe to that as well. So wherever you call this service function, you have to subscribe to this, and once you retrieve the data, it has to be stored in this variable, and this data has to be added to this particular variable. So this post is equal to retrieve data, and since we already have the data for the post inside the HTML of this, that is, we have it like here, right? So we have the let post of post. That's gonna work just similar to how you normally do it through the normal mock-post. So in this way, you can retrieve the data back from the service layer, and you can showcase that data to the front-end user. So now let's move forward with this, and let's actually implement the delete functionality as well. Okay. So for that, what I'll do is that I'll go to my post component where we have the individual post. So let's go to the HTML part of that, and then that let's actually remove this, go somewhere. Let's actually completely remove the A tag because we'll be creating a button, right? So let me create a button, and let's say it's going to be delete. Let me stylize this. If I now save this and go to the browser, you'll see that we have a delete button. So now what we want to happen is that when I click on this, a particular function has to be executed, right? So there's going to be an event that has to be fired. So we've already covered the events part inside our JavaScript learning path. So if you haven't seen that, it's better you watch that out first. Once you're done with that, then you can carry on from here. So right now we'll be creating an event, but the main difference here is that the syntax for creating an event inside of Angular is a bit different. Okay. So let's say you want to create an on-click event for this button. So whenever this button is clicked, event has to be executed. So you have to type events inside of parentheses. So the event is a click, right? So that is the event. So whenever that button has clicked, a function has to be executed. So in this case, I can type my function as, let's say, delete or on delete. Okay, so that is my function. If I now go to my TS file of this particular post, so let's go to the TS file and let's actually create the function. So it's going to be on delete. So whenever I click on this button, this function has to be executed, right? So on the click event, a function is being executed that is on delete. That is present inside the TS file. So now what I can do is that I can actually call my service layer to actually delete this particular, post from the database. So let me close this off and let's go to the service layer. Let's create a function to actually delete the post from the database. Okay. So let me type it as, let's say, delete post. As a delete post, and let's leave it as observable because we'll be using that in the future, but it's not an array. Okay, so you don't need that anymore. Let me delete that. Now what we have to do is that instead of using get, you have to use delete. So as I previously said, you're going to use delete to delete something from the URL. The thing is that you're not actually deleting all the post. Instead, you're actually deleting just a single post. And if you see in the browser, if you go to the database, if I type in /1, that's giving me the first post, right? So essentially we can write the base URL and append the ID of the post, and that's going to give me my post that I'm trying to access. So in this case, if I want to delete a particular post, I have to use this base URL and append that with the ID of the post that I want to delete. So in this case, I have to take the ID from the user, right? So I have to take that from the event that is calling this. So let's take the ID as the input, and it's going to be a number. Now I can do this. What I can do is that I can create a new URL. So I'll create a new URL. Okay, so now I have created a new URL and I've used the ES6 template literals to actually create that. So the first part of that is going to be the base URL that we have at the top. Then I have a slash. Then the next part is going to be the ID that we are retrieving from the user. So instead of this API URL, I have to use the normal URL, and that particular logic will be executed. Now I have to call this function where I want to actually delete the post. So in this case, I want to call that from the post component. So for that, I have to create another variable to access the service layer. So let me create that. So I have created a new instance of the service layer. Now I can access the service layer using this particular variable. So let me go to my on delete and I'll type in, like, let's say this dot post service dot delete post, and that has to be subscribed because that is observable. So it's going to be subscribed, but we don't have any logic right now. That has to be executed once it has been deleted, right? So let's leave subscribe as empty. Now for this delete post, I have to pass in my ID of the post that I want to delete. Since we already have the post data inside my post1 variable, I can just type in this .post1.id, and that should actually give me the ID of the post that I want to delete. So now if I execute this, let's actually go to the browser and see if it's working or not. So let me refresh this. Yeah, so we have the data. Let's go here and we have the post, right? Let me zoom out a bit. Okay, so we have something like this. Okay, now if I click on delete, so let's click on post delete file. So there's nothing happening here, but if I go to my database and if I refresh, you'll see that we only have 4 posts now. That means that post has been deleted. So if I go back to page and if I refresh the page, you'll see that post 5 has disappeared. That means that the data has been deleted, but this particular component that we have here is not being refreshed, right? So whenever you click on delete, it has to delete that from the database, and also it has to refresh this particular UI. So we'll be covering that particular logic in the next video, and also we'll be covering how we can actually create a new blog post as well. Okay. Right, so before closing this off, I just wanted to say that this video was made in collaboration with PacketPrep. So PacketPrep is a training and placement company located in Hyderabad, and these videos were specifically made for the job guarantee training program that they have going on right now, and that is the full stack Java developer program. So apart from these free video lectures, they also have some premium content as well, like lecture notes, practice and test papers for you to get better at your core concepts. And they also have offline as well as online classes for this program. And they also conduct multiple demo sessions as well. So you can attend any of these demo sessions and understand the things they are teaching as well as their training approach firsthand. So if you're interested, I provided the website link in the description down below. You can go there and check them out. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you have liked what you've seen till now. If you did, then please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.